Welcome back to Behind the Grind with Marcus Mosher. And we are going to go a little bit deeper, a little more in depth. We talked about some news and notes right off the top of the show there. You can go catch that on the other part of it, rewind it, whatever you got to do, it's there. But we want to go deeper. We want to find out what your favorite analyst is thinking, how they got to where they are, and why they don't look like Mike Tyson from Punch Out in their Twitter profile. So we're going to touch base on that a little bit more because, hey, I'll be honest, when I got down to Canton there for the Fantasy Football Expo, I was expecting Mike Tyson to sit across from me. And clearly, that was some false advertising there. I seen you across and we bumped into each other there.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I know a lot of people said the same thing. They were expecting 8-bit Mike Tyson to just be at the expo, but sorry to let everybody down.
You know what? I would have settled for a 6-bit there, but 8-bit. But hey, the expo, great time. If you get a chance, you have to hit down there. Major was there, Marcus was there, I was there. Tara, well, hopefully she's there this year. We're hoping. But hey, if you were to roll in to the expo this year, I mean, whether it's at the Hall of Fame or the hotel or wherever we're at, and you all of a sudden got because you remember that nice little stadium they had there, right? If you're walking into that and all of a sudden some music cues up and all of a sudden you get the crowd going there, what's that music to introduce 8-bit Mike Tyson to the people?
Yeah, it's probably the Punch Out theme song from the great NES video game, right? Like, it's just so good. It just gets you fired right up. But listen, I've thought about this a lot. Everybody has like a walk up song. Like if you're in baseball, I think I would do some Johnny Cash. I think I've always been a big Johnny Cash song. So let's do Ring of Fire. That's what we're gonna go with.
There you go.
So
nice.
It's been a historic thing on this show, kind of like a rite of passage, where we have to hear you sing a little bit of Ring of Fire.
No, that's not going to happen because I know what's going to happen. That's going to end up on Twitter, and I'll have to delete the account.
Absolutely, it'll end up on Twitter. Almost. I think we had one person entertain us on that so far, and all the shows that we've done. We've done a lot of these.
You almost got me.
Yeah. So we all know like sports is really important to all of us. I think we all kind of play, little league sports. What sports did you play growing up, and what were your favorite teams?
Yeah, so played a little bit of football growing up, but my sport was really basketball. I love basketball for so many different reasons. Played it from the 5 until I was in college, but I've always loved the NFL. So even when I was in high school, it started with the Madden video games and football cards and fantasy football. I remember playing fantasy football when I was like 14 years old.
Wow.
The NFL has always been my favorite sport. Football has been my passion. When I was in high school, I didn't play because I like to scout. So the high school would send me on scouting trips to go look at other high schools because they could trust my reports when I wrote up these teams. So I've just always been in love with the game of football.
That's cool.
Wow.
I love that you mentioned those sports there because right above you there on the screen, is a former junior college running back from the College of the Canyons there, number 9, Major Caldwell. And I just have to give him a show.
Love it.
All right.
One second there, Tara. So you mentioned like basketball was kind of that first love kind of thing, that first sport for you. But what were some of your favorite? I know you're a Pennsylvania guy there. So what were some of your favorite teams and players then growing up?
Well, I mean, if you're watching this on YouTube right now, you can see that I got some Cowboy jerseys behind me. I diehard Cowboy fan. Still am. The losses still sting as much as they did when I was. I know. When I was 7 or 8 years old, I can remember taking those losses really, really hard. I'll give you an example. I was in 9th grade when Tony Romo fumbled the snap in the playoff game, which everybody remembers. And I remember going to school the following Monday, and people would walk by me and they would just drop their books right in front of me and start laughing because they were emulating Tony Romo. Listen, that hurts, man. So I've never gotten over stuff like that. I remain a diehard fan today. Listen, I think the NFL is better when you have a team that you passionately root for.
So how does that even work? How's a Pennsylvania guy
That's a good question.
Like, you're not quite in Philadelphia. You're not in Pittsburgh, but I'm sure there's more than a few Eagles fans where you were growing up. How do you become that Dallas Cowboys fan in Pennsylvania?
So it's a great question. My dad was a big Cowboy fan, and back in the early 70s, the only team that was on national TV was the Cowboys. The Steelers in the late 60s weren't very good. They got better in the 70s, and they weren't on very often. So he only got to watch the Cowboys. And then when you are a 4-year-old, you kind of look up to your dad, and he's showing me replays of the Cowboys beating the Steelers on my TV when I'm 4 or 5 years old. You just you get born into it.
I love that. I'm trying to brain mush my 5-year-old, but it's not working out. I got to try harder.
Just keep really showing them the same highlights over and over again. Eventually it'll work. At least it did with me.
No. Before we move on to the next question, actually, favorite Cowboy ever?
That's a tough one. It's probably Tony Romo. As you can see behind me, I've got a jersey of Tony Romo. I just loved kind of the story of Romo, right? Like, undrafted free agent, didn't play the first 3 years, and then when he got a shot, he took advantage of it. Romo will always have a soft spot in my heart.
Nice. And now one of the favorite NFL NFL analysts.
I love listening to him. He's so good.
Now, other than the decision to scout high school football teams, name a decision that changed the trajectory of your life. And the one caveat is that you can't say marriage or birth of a child.
This is a really good question. So when I was in college, I went to Edinburgh University, Matt, as you mentioned at the top, and I went for middle school history. I was a middle school history teacher for 3 or 4 years, and I did that. And during my prep periods, I was on Twitter. I was writing just little freelance blog posts. I was cutting up GIFs, and it got to be the summer after 2017. And my wife is like, you know what? Hey, Marcus, do you still have a passion for this? And I'm like, yeah, it's okay. She's like, I know you love football. Why don't you go see if you can make a career doing football stuff? And I kind of laughed it off. And she's like, no, I'm serious. It's okay. Go try to do it. Go try to see if you can do it for a year and see how things work out. So I did it. I applied to a couple of different websites. Eventually got accepted by USA Today, and since then I've been a full-time freelance writer doing football podcasts on the Cowboys, NFL stuff, and I'm truly living and doing my dream job right now.
Nice. What are some of the biggest changes that you've seen in yourself now when you started versus now?
I try to be a little bit less emotional than I was back in 2016, 2017, right? I try to take a deep breath and not overreact to what I see, on Sundays. And I think that's a good thing if you're like a fantasy analysis or you play dynasty leagues, especially if you play dynasty leagues, because it's so easy to see something play out on Sunday and think that's going to happen for the rest of a player's career, right? Take a step back, try not to look at things so emotionally. You'll be better off. And I think that'll help you win your fantasy leagues. It'll help you be better in life. Just trying to be a little bit less emotional has been something that I've really tried to practice.
Yeah. So you just mentioned that, you kind of got into the writing thing. You got a push from family and all that good stuff. Mm-hmm. But at what point do you decide that you wanted to make fantasy sports more than a hobby?
Well, fantasy has always been something I love, right? I mean, I can remember, I think I was 10 years old and I would do the auto drafts on ESPN and I would get up in the morning and see who my team was and stuff. I've always just had a passion for that, right? And then, looking at Twitter and the fantasy football community, I think it's fantastic. I think some of the best content creators, not just in sports, but anywhere, are in the fantasy community. And it's always evolving and people are writing such smart things. I can remember RotoViz in 2016, how awesome they were and how cutting edge they were. And I've always wanted to be a part of that. So I got some great help from Matt Williamson, from Ryan McDowell, to kind of get me into the fantasy, platform and forum. And I've just enjoyed it so much since then.
Yeah, and we all have these like home leagues. What's your favorite home league? What's that league that you started with your friends from like elementary school and you're still playing in
Yeah.
it?
So I have a 20-team redraft league with my family, which here I'm going to show you something in a second. Look,
That's amazing.
I got the trophy this year via Trophy Smack, which we saw at the Fantasy Football Expo, and we've got all the previous winners on it. It's my favorite. It's my favorite league to play in. It's so much fun. Trash talking your aunt and your uncle when you beat them is a blast.
Now, what happens when they beat you?
Oh my gosh, you have no idea. Like if you do fantasy football stuff for a living and you lose to your aunt, you
Right.
never hear. I mean, you never live it down, right? So that's always a blast.
So
How many times have you won that championship?
This year is my third year. So we've been doing it since 2004. And this is the third year, but 20 teams in a redraft league.
That's
We
a
all
lot.
get together. We do an auction draft. We do it in actually my basement. It's a blast. You can't beat it.
That's cool.
So I got to know that because you're the Cowboys fan. There's always going to be Thanksgiving. You're going to get probably a good chunk of these 20 competitors in this league together on Thanksgiving. 3 games are going on that day. What is that Thanksgiving dinner like?
It's a madhouse, right? It's crazy. And unfortunately, the Cowboys have ruined many of my Thanksgiving, so that's never been fun. But it's a blast. We all get together and we try to watch as many games together during the season as possible. That's partly why I love football, is because when you're watching games with family and friends, it's a blast.
So you mentioned USA Today, that's where you got that foot in the door.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about the Locked On podcast, there, Locked On the Dynasty, Locked On the Cowboys, the Raiders Wire, all that stuff. Who haven't you actually written for? Like, I'm looking through this. There's like Bleacher Report, a contributor on Yahoo, The Athletic, Dallas Fort Worth, I believe, was in there.
Mm-hmm.
Pro Football Weekly, Fansided. I mean, bookies.com, I think you were an author there too. So, I mean, we talk about trajectory, we talk about that grind in the fantasy industry, and some people, I know Tara, she's got her foot in about 4 different places right now too, creating content that way. Talk about the importance of kind of spreading out there a little bit, maybe what's networking so much with some other analysts out there and how that's helped you.
Yeah, networking is huge because you've got to know people to get your foot in the door to give you a chance. It's why we do things like the Fantasy Football Expo, and we do Twitter Spaces, is just to meet new people. That's really important. But for young people trying to get in this business, it's really about not saying no early on. Like anytime somebody gives you an opportunity to do something, even if it's, hey, write this 300-word article for me, or, it might not be the most exciting thing, but just do it. Get practice, get reps. It's what makes you better. And the more places that you can contribute and work for, the better chance that you'll get recognized and known. So any young writers out there, just go find your opportunities, go find chances, and make it worth it.
I'll definitely challenge people to write a 200, 300-word article, because those are a lot harder than it sounds.
But be concise,
everything
right?
you want in 200 words. Let's kind of go back to that expo here, because we talked about that networking kind of feeding into this question here. I mean, that was a networking bonanza. I mean, who were some of the people that maybe you hadn't quite interacted with previously that you had an opportunity to kind of interact with at the expo?
Well, Matt, you're a perfect example, right? We just sat there, I think the first day, we introduced each other, and look, we're doing a podcast together. This is fantastic. Like, this is what it's all about. And this is why I enjoyed my time so much there. But, being able to like meet Bob Harris in person, who I know you guys have had on the show, like Bob is the absolute best, like just the greatest guy in the world. To meet him and to meet Michael Fabiano and Mike Clay. So those don't always lead to jobs, but to know those people and get to share ideas and go on each other's podcasts is a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think we kind of did things backwards. We had about everyone on the podcast before we actually met them. So it was kind of nice to, I mean, I could see you right now. We're talking right now and all that other fun stuff, but to actually get in person, I think that was the first time Major and I ran into each other in person. He's a Cali guy. I'm Canadian. So, I mean, that was the first time that we actually got to meet each other. And then obviously Bob Harris, like you said, I owe a lot to him and everything that he's done to help me out. So to get to meet him and thank him personally, I mean, this is nice. What we're doing right now here on the show is nice, but to actually talk to someone in person, it just hits a little bit different.
Yeah. And it's different just to sit and hang and, learn about how they got started and where, what they're doing for content. It's really cool.
Yeah. No, speaking of different podcasts and different interviews, what are some of your most memorable interviews?
Oh man. That's a really good question. So I'll say this, we'll keep it with the Fantasy Football Expo theme. So Ryan Mcdowell was somebody who I listened to religiously on the Dynasty Blueprint podcast, right? When he was doing that way back when. And I got the chance to interview him for a different show that I was working on, and it went great. And I talked to him for like an hour after the podcast. And we eventually came up with this idea to like, hey, we should do a daily podcast and let's go to do it on the Locked On Podcast Network. And now we share a podcast for Locked On Dynasty. I think that interview with Ryan was one of my favorites. I interviewed Matt Williamson, who we all know very well, a titan in the fantasy football industry. But I think my favorite was Matt Waldman. Waldman is one of the best fantasy football guys out there. I got to have him on my Locked On Cowboys podcast earlier this year. And when I say I've been listening to him forever, like I think I started listening to him on the very first show of the Audible. So to get him on the show and talk about wide receiver prospects was it was a joy. If you would have told 24-year-old me that I got to interview Matt Waldman, I would have been so friggin' happy. I had no idea.
It's funny because you're trying to play cool, right? You're trying to be cool about.
I couldn't do it. I just did out the whole time.
I couldn't even try, right?
Meanwhile, it's like
That's great.
the one thing you're trying to avoid is fanboy, but at that point, you don't even care anymore. It's like when you're talking about Matt Waldman and that scouting report that he puts out every year, and you get to talk about the draft. I mean, yeah, you're right. Just sit back and let him do his thing and just enjoy every second of it. One of the most genuine guys out there as well.
And I think that's why I love the fantasy football community too, is because they're so willing to help each other. I mean, you'll have Waldman go on an hour podcast for free just to talk football because he loves it so much, or Sigmund Bloom or pop on, or Bob Harris. And in most other industries, it doesn't work that way. But in our industry, everybody loves to give back, and it's why it's so cool.
100% agree. Yeah, that's definitely one of my favorite things about the industry. It's so unique, so much different than other job fields.
It is.
Now, if you were not into fantasy sports and teacher was not an option, got to take that away. I like my caveats. What would you be doing?
Oh, that's a really good question. I probably would be some kind of accountant or something boring like that, where you sit behind a desk for 8 hours a day, staring at a screen, hating my life, and just looking forward to the weekend. Unfortunately, it's not something I've ever been interested in. It basically from when I was really young, I've kind of always known that I wanted to either be a teacher or do football stuff. And eventually I got burnt out doing the teaching stuff for a couple of years, and a path opened up with me for football because honestly, Tara, I don't know if there's anything else that I could do and do well.
Love it.
I mean, I thought she was going to put another caveat there saying scouting wasn't an option. I really thought you were going to go to the scouting.
I can add him on.
No, well, I knew what she meant. She was just talking about like the football industry in general.
Yeah.
So we mentioned all these different publications that you've worked with, but the one that we haven't talked about is, can I call you the Wikipedia wizard? Is that something I could actually coin
Sure, you
right
can
now?
do that. That's fine. Yeah, sure. Why not?
Because when I do my internet stalking of our guests, like that's how I got with the Edinburgh there, and I went onto Wikipedia. I'm like, I'm going to see what kind of information. So I type in your name with Wikipedia, and it's like you have you've a write up for like 40 different players there between the Cowboys and Raiders as an author or a part of an author or however that looks. I mean, and how do you even edit Wikipedia? Like, I don't even know how you go about the wiki world.
Listen, I've never edited a Wikipedia in my life. So somebody out there is doing it and they're attaching some of my articles, but I'm pretty sure at this point I've written over 15,000 articles. So eventually a few of them are going to hit. So it's just about volume. I guess you can call me a volume shooter here.
Well,
It's like
I thought
someone
maybe you were like,
wink.
I really thought that it was like you're going on Wikipedia and you're like correcting
No.
everything and
I
updating
listen.
it.
I wouldn't have enough hours of the day to go do that.
Oh man. So back to the fantasy sports industry. You kind of talk about biggest changes you've seen in yourself. What are some of the biggest changes you've seen in the industry?
It's a really good question. I think, let's say like in the 2014, 2015, it was very film based. Hey, this is what I see on film. These are the raw stats. This is what I think is going to happen going forward. But now you've got so many little niche markets, right? You've got the film parts, you've got the analytics, and you even in the analytics, you have like subsection of people in fantasy football that really dive into certain analytics, whether it be receivers or air yards. Like air yards, it became a really big popular thing. So I think before everybody had to know everything, and now, hey, you just carve out a little niche market or a little niche idea, and you could run with it. And I think that's fantastic. I think it's great that people can specialize in just one subsection of fantasy football and make a living.
Yeah.
So just kind of on that, like what would you say your specialty is when it comes to your writing? What's your strength? I know you talk about the scouting, where we're talking about a little bit of the recent Senior Bowl here a little bit. Is that probably where you feel, is that what you enjoy the most, I guess? Because usually what you enjoy the most is what you're the strongest at.
Yeah, I for me, it's always been the scouting part of it, watching the tape, trying to put together an idea of what a player or what a prospect is. But over the last couple of years, I've tried to get caught up on analytics. Listen, I'm not the smartest person in the world when it comes to numbers and graphs and all that kind of stuff, but I try to read other people's stuff and try to apply that to what I'm watching on film. So if I see if I see a tight end is lining up in the slot a bunch and that's translating into fantasy production, it's a good way to go back and check. Hey, if tight ends line up in the slot more often than I line up in line, does that mean more fantasy points or more opportunities or more targets? I think trying to contextualize what you're watching on film is something that I've tried to get good at. I'm hoping that's what my readers and my listeners like in my content.
I have to agree with that. I'm not what you'd call the most intelligent individual out there. And I am a diehard dinosaur when it comes to film. It's still the eye test for me, but there's an absolute place for analytics when it comes to scouting. I mean, there's no absolute. A guy can look good on film and be a bust. A guy can actually blow your mind with analytics and be a bust, and vice versa. So I think finding that if scouting was easy, everyone would be doing it, right?
Right, and I think we get the best overall picture of a player when you do combine the two, right? And now we can argue about what's more important and stuff, but I think combining the two is how we figure out who's good and who's bad. I never really understood the argument one against the other.
Yeah. So, and I guess in addition to this, we kind of talked about the changes that you've seen in yourself, but what has fantasy sports kind of taught you about yourself?
That's a really good question. That I need to listen like 3 times more than I talk, because there's a lot of people out there that are smarter than me. So the more that you can listen, the more you can read and talk to people, the smarter that you're ultimately become. Because I think maybe earlier in my career, maybe I thought I was better than I was at certain parts of this. And the more you read, the more you study, you learn that you're not. So I try to listen. I try to talk to other people and get other ideas, because I think that ultimately is going to help you grow, not only as a fantasy content creator, but as a person.
Yeah, at the beginning of the show, you mentioned a couple people who helped you out, but who's some of the other people that helped you along the way in your fantasy career?
The one, I'm really glad you asked for this question, because I have not mentioned this guy yet, but Sigmund Bloom. Seeing a theme here with the Audible people, I listen to them a lot. Sigmund Bloom, early on in my career, did a great job of not only kind of pushing me to pursue my passion, but helping me along the way, like giving me feedback on articles I had written or tweets that I had on or prospect stuff. And Sigmund was always so kind with his time. He was always so helpful, so positive. I can promise you I wouldn't even be anything close to what I am now without Sigmund. So he's somebody that I just really respect and really look up to, and I'm very, very thankful to have him in my life.
Yeah, you got a couple more you want to throw in there? It's this your time to give all your shout outs.
I'm afraid that I'm going to miss people because I've been so lucky. Michael Fabiano has been wonderful. Bob Harris, as we mentioned before, Cecil Lammy, Sean Siegel, Matt Freeman, the Fantasy Douche, who I'm sure you guys remember from a couple of years ago, was always really good to me. Again, I'm afraid I'm going to miss somebody, but so many good people in the fantasy industry.
Yeah, I know when I'm listening to podcasts here. Sorry, Major, to cut you off. I know when I'm listening to the podcast, like we mentioned that Locked on the Dynasty with Ryan Mcdowell, fantastic show there. One of my other shows I love to watch or listen to is the Power Ranking show because Elliot Harrison, he is like a historical encyclopedia when it comes to the National Football League. Forget about fantasy football. Forget about that. I mean, you could ask him he's like the Sean McVay of what we do. You know what I mean? It's absolutely unbelievable. So, I mean, we talk about guys that you worked with and stuff like that. What is that like just to pick someone's brain like Elliot Harrison? Because, I mean, I'm not fanboying here by any stretch of anyone's imagination. He's just, when you listen to him, it's like, I can't even remember what my kids' names are. Now, in my defense, there's like 10 of them. Okay.
Yeah.
But I mean,
I got a really good story about Elliot. So, I did not know Elliot at all. In 2015, he posted just a random Cowboys trivia question on Twitter, and I responded to it because I'm a huge football nerd. And he DM'd me. He's like, "Hey, can you call me?" He's like, and then he called me and he's like, "Hey, how did you know that answer?" I'm like, "Oh, I watched this game with my dad, blah, 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 blah." Since then, we've basically talked every single day. He's a great friend of mine. I actually just got off the phone with him before I jumped on this podcast, but there's nobody in the world that is better when it comes to history than Elliot Harrison. I've learned so much from him. I think he is incredible. He's just kind of starting to get back into the football community after taking a couple of years off, but the guy is just an absolute unit when it comes to anything NFL. He's incredible.
You might have to hook us up with him on the show here.
Oh, of course, anytime. He would love to jump on.
Yeah. My last question to you is like, I mean, throughout the show, you've been given gems, so I hope people really caught those. But if you have some advice to give to those who are trying to make it in the industry right now.
I think the most important thing is just find your niche. Find the one or two things you do really well and try to perfect that, whether it's a certain article, whether it's podcasting, whether it's a piece of content, whether it's, just one idea. Find something and be unique, because if you're good in this industry, people will find you and they'll come listen to you and they'll read you. You don't have to be a big time reporter or have 1 million Twitter followers. Just create good and unique content and it'll work out.
Nice.
You mentioned those 25,000 articles or 250,000 articles that you've written. Is there any of those articles in particular that just hit different for you? Is there like that favorite article, the one that maybe it's not your best article, but it was your favorite one to write? And if so, what was that like? What was that process for you?
Yeah, I got to write a story back in 2016 about kind of the life of Des Bryant and how he kind of became the player and the person he is today. I got to interview him. It was really one of the first stories I did, like, how I want to say, like big J journalism, right? Like hard hitting and factual, and got to tell a story. So that one was probably my favorite. But in terms of like fantasy stuff, oh man, I used to do a wide receiver report where I looked at every receiver in the NFL's best route and why they were so good at that route and how that translated into fantasy production. That might have to be an article I bring back this summer.
Well, that kind of ties in with your advice that you were giving, because that sounds like being niche, right? And that sounds like you found that one thing that wasn't really, I know we don't, Matt Harmon, he does kind of a reception perception, but finding that one article, that one pattern for the wide receiver and what they do best. That's like finding the one thing that as an analyst that we do best and find a way to do it even better to kind of create separation, if you will, when it comes to things. Now, Marcus, you've been fantastic here so far on the show. It's been awesome just kind of sitting back, listening. I know we chatted a little bit there in Canton, but I mean, this is different. This is a whole sit down for an hour talking about you and how you got to where you got. And I mean, you did it in a relatively short period of time compared to a lot of individuals there. You mentioned, I think you're pretty young even still today. And we look at that trajectory that I keep coming back to the word trajectory when we talk about careers and stuff. And you've put the work in. I mean, getting started with USA Today right off the hop is impressive. But I mean, that's a Bachelor of Education kind of paying off a little bit there too, because I don't write well. I don't speak well. So education's not my strength.
Caveman.
Pretty much. I'm just a slightly above a caveman. Well, I'm probably not. But we talk about that. And did you ever expect when you committed to fantasy or committed to what you're doing now, you'd be where you are right at this moment back then?
No, I'd be lying if I said I did. I honestly thought I would do this for a year, make a couple bucks on the side, and have to go back to either being a substitute teacher or going to do something else. It takes a lot of luck to do this full time. It takes the right people seeing your content. It takes the right people opening up doors. I've been very fortunate, and it's just the truth. But the USA Today job that you mentioned, I wasn't qualified at all. I had no writing experience for any big websites. I didn't have a degree in journalism. I just happened to get an interview with one of the bosses over there, and they took a leap of faith and they thought it would work. And I'm hoping that it has so far for them.
Well, then I guess for anyone who's watching right now, I guess that's the thing. We've talked about this last season and season 1. Just do it. Just go out there and put yourself out there. You may not be a good podcaster the first 10 episodes. Heck, we're on episode 112 and I'm still no good. But hey, I set that bar nice and low, so the expectation for everyone else is a lot easier to deal with.
Matt, you know what's funny is today I went and listened to an old episode of my Locked On Cowboys podcast, actually episode 200. And I was like, holy cow, I was so bad back then. It's rep. I've done over 1,100 episodes of the Locked On Cowboys podcast. So it's all about reps and practicing, and you'll get better. Yeah. You just need to put in the time and the work to do it.
Now, what was the transition between, because a lot of people talk about this, a lot of people start off specifically with writing. What's the transition of going specifically from writing to then also transitioning into fielding out different areas as multimedia starts to expand within the fantasy industry?
Yeah, so we'll talk the Locked On Dynasty podcast, right? So I was writing for about a year with the Raiders podcast, and eventually somebody came and said, "Hey, I like the way that you write. Have you ever tried podcasting?" My answer was no. I've never done it before. I think I recorded the first time I did an episode. I did a 10-minute episode that probably took me about 3 hours because I kept stumbling over my words and I wasn't confident. But I think being able to do some different things, right? Being able to podcast, to write, to do radio hits and all that kind of stuff, it just helps you grow as a content creator, as a person. And I think being well-rounded is certainly really important in our industry, because you never know what the next business or company is going to, ask you to do.
Yeah.
I love that. That's really good advice for anyone who's listening here. I think this whole show has had all kinds of tidbits, like Major had mentioned. So if you're listening back, you're going to find something that speaks to you at some point during this show. So Marcus, thanks for that. And I mean, if you're looking for Marcus, there are many different places to find it. We talked about the Locked On the Cowboys, Locked On Dynasty, the Raider Wire there. And then, you know what? You might find his stuff on the Athletic, Dallas-Fort Worth, on Yahoo, USA Today. I mean, where aren't you right now? Am I missing anything?
I also do some content for the Game Day NFL. Do a little stuff behind the scenes for PFF and ESPN. But yeah, you nailed most of the spots.
Wow, I think we found someone who like has more spots than Tara.
I was gonna
That's
say I was gonna
impressive.
jump in.
That's
And like I love hearing this. What's it like? Because I think this is common for a lot of people coming in and wanting to get into the industry and looking to lock on with multiple contracting jobs. What is it like juggling that many different outlets that you're working for on a regular basis?
And then a little bit further. Sorry, Marcus, a little bit further. How do you decide what article goes to what site?
Yeah.
Great question.
It's a good question. So it's really hard to find in this industry, like a full-time job where you're at one website, like, or one business. There's just not that many of those jobs. So a lot of people like Tara and I, we've got to kind of piece out some of our work, and it's actually not a bad thing, right? Being able to work at multiple places is kind of good because you get to have different ideas and different ways of doing things. But for the writing part, it's not too bad. For certain websites like the Raiders Wire, obviously that's Raiders content only. But for the game day and bookies and some of these other sites that I do, it's all kind of the same stuff. You're just having to repackage it and sell it in different ways. And then for the podcast, I do a Cowboys podcast and a Dynasty football podcast. Those are entirely different, but you're still covering the same sport. So it all works out. It's hard to, figure out a schedule and stuff, but eventually you get used to it. You find what works for you. I actually enjoy it. I think I like doing this more than if I was just, let's say, at Yahoo or CBS Sports or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, there you have it. Marcus juggles content creations, much like I juggle children in my own home.
Accurate.
So with that being said, this has been Behind the Grind with Marcus Mosher. I probably said his name 4 times wrong. I've tried to keep on going.
No, you're
back
good.
there,
Don't worry about it. You're good.
But hey, every single week we are coming with the Dynasty Vipers Vipercast. Major, you can find him on Sundays there doing some stuff with Fantasy Points. And we talk about Tara juggling her stuff there with Awesemo and Fantasy Pros, Fantasy Alarm. And again, we are all about that networking and how key it is with everything that we are doing. So, Marcus, thanks for just coming in on the show here, talking shop with us a little bit and kind of giving our listeners a little bit more of an insight of what it's like to get behind the grind with yourself here.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me on. Really, really appreciate it. This was an absolute blast. And if I can ever do anything to repay the favor, please let me know.
Well, you might want to be careful about that.
Anything, Matt. Anything.
Matt is a great producer, man. So Matt has all kind of great ideas.
Yeah. So you and me, we're gonna do some chest waxing a little bit later for charity.
Let's do it.
That's not one of them, Matt. I just set you up, bro.
Really but we're good.
You just can't get it right.
You know I can't leave well enough. You know I can't get out when I'm ahead. It's not in my style.
The show is over, man.
All
All you had to do is say nothing.
We could do like a mustache competition. I could try to grow out my mustache.
Oh, you don't want none of that, Marcus.
It would take me a while, but
if there's one thing that Matt does is grow hair. You know what I mean?
Well,
on his face and back and ears and everything else, except his head. You know what I mean?
If you're listening to us right now on Apple or Spotify, you can't quite get the visual of what's on top of my head, but there's nothing to see there either. So, I mean, when Major uses growing hair, he's not talking about the top of the head. That's definitely for sure.
I wear a hat.
So again, Dynasty Vipers Vipercast, episode 112, Behind the Grind. Head over to fantasypoints.com. Get that prescription for that subscription today. Get that 30% off right up into the Super Bowl. Who Marcus has the Los Angeles Rams knocking off the Cincinnati Bengals.
It's
at least
concrete
till
now.
next week. That being said, we will see you next time. Take care now.